Thanks for joining us for FreePlay's online festival. This is the final panel in the online festival. I'm Dan Golding, FreePlay Director, and I'm going to chair this panel, which will be, I think, it's a personal highlight for me. And I hope it's perhaps not too indulgent to ask our audience to return with us to the origins of FreePlay. So first of all, thanks to our online festival sponsors, Surprise Attack, and a bit of info about FreePlay. We're running all week here in Melbourne. Our physical in-person events really kick off after tonight. And we've still got tickets to our symposium on Sunday, April 19 available, so visit freeplay.net.au for more info about that. So today, this panel is FreePlay 2004, FreePlay 2 Words 2004 Co-Founders Look Back. And joining us, we've got Marcus Westbury, who is here in Melbourne, and you might know Marcus from a whole host of amazing ventures that he's been part of over the years, from the TV series Not Quite Art, but he's also the founder of many cultural events and institutions, including Renew Newcastle and Renew Australia, which has been doing amazing things over the last couple of years. And we've also got Katharine Neal from Paris, just outside Paris, who is a games developer. And Katharine, I'm sure we'll talk about this, was the one of the minds behind Escape from Woomera in the early 2000s here in Melbourne, and now does a whole bunch of stuff with games. She did Alone in the Park a while back, and some work with Punch Drunk Games. That's the title, isn't it, Katharine?
Oh, no, Lady Shotgun and then Tickety Boom.
Yeah, that's correct. Right, that's what I was thinking of. Sorry. So I guess to begin, it's sort of an odd thing for a current festival director to be kind of interviewing the founders of the festival. But how did FreePlay begin? Let's start at the start.
Do you want to have a go at that, or do you want me to start, Katharine?
Oh, well, I guess, I could have a go. So, Marcus contacted me about Escape from Woomera, being part of, he was director of Next Wave at the time. Next Wave is a festival in Melbourne, quite a big one, for new and emerging artists. And lots of big events as well, and he was going around sort of trying to meet people, trying to get people involved, and at the time I had been I'd been kind of like hoping to talk to him actually, because I'd been the previous year at the This Is Not Art Festival, which, as I'm sure many people are aware, Marcus founded, if not co-founded, I'm not sure, but so that was a massive annual festival. I think it's still going, is it, Marcus?
Yes, it's going up in Newcastle, yeah.
And I did a panel on independent games there, hoping to sort of like maybe secretly approach the famous Marcus Westbury and see if he was interested in doing a sub-festival as part of Tina, actually, because Tina has, Tina obviously grew into lots of different sub-festivals. And so by coincidence, Marcus was probably thinking along similar lines, and got in touch with me and said, hey, get Escape from Woomera somehow involved in the festival. And I was like, how about, because Escape from Woomera is kind of almost over, why not something more broad for how about like a day or a few hours of independent game stuff? And he's like, fuck that, 3 days, and here's how we and he sent me off to find out if people would turn up, so I went on Samir and stuff, and and then I found, I sort of discovered people would turn up, and Marcus said, okay, then let's get this funded and let's create a vision for this. So then we rounded up other people like Jim Batt and Rebecca Cannon and other names that people might know from from around the arts and the industry and that sort of thing. Is that? But it's a long time ago, so I might be remembering things completely wrong. What's your memory of things, Marcus?
No, it's kind of reassuring. It actually is a lot similar to how I remember it. I'd done the This Is Not Art Festival in Newcastle for about 5 years. So I started that in 1997, and I guess it's got multiple bits that make it up, and I guess I'd founded some bits of it, and I'd co-founded others and got other people involved. So by the time I left Tina, which was 2002, Tina had an independent record labels event. It had the National Young Writers Festival, which was supporting small publishers, zine makers, all that sort of stuff. It had Electro Fringe, which was kind of electronic media experimentation, DIY arts festival, and it had all these elements. And I think around the time we had that conversation, I was very much of the view that, like, games was the next bit I wanted to add to Tina before I left it, because games were like the missing bit of my cultural mix that wasn't really represented in that mix. And then at the time we met up, I think I dropped Katharine a line when there was one of the many escape from Woomera controversies that was going around at the time. We met up and kind of connected, and it was very much this kind of like, that was on my radar as something I wanted to do. Next Wave was in a position to do it, and Katharine was like the missing piece of the puzzle for me in terms of, like, I didn't know the game. I knew games as a consumer or a user or someone who enjoyed playing games and kind of had a sort of cultural kind of take on it, but I didn't know the industry. I didn't know. There's a lot of missing pieces of that puzzle to me, and I think we sort of came together around that, and it sort of kicked off from there, really.
Mm. And so, Escape from Woomera has been mentioned a few times. I think most people probably would know what that is, but just for context, I mean, what? So you said, Katharine, that it was over. What do you mean by that? Like it petered out, the interest in it, or?
Oh, not so much. Well, I was kind of thinking from my perspective in terms of, well, it was kind of, I guess it was becoming old news, and well, to be honest, the main thing is, like, I don't think I wasn't convinced that it needed more forums in which to discuss it. I mean, we'd already discussed it, Tina, and or we were going to. I can't remember the order of events, but I had over the year or so preceding. I mean, the reason I did the panel at Tina was because I was really frustrated by what I found to be the attitude in Australia and I guess the world towards games. And I was trying to get funding for our project, but in many quarters it was like, well, games aren't culturally worthy, so and there's no visibility, and I knew that independent game development was going on, and I was also kind of inspired by stuff like the Scratchway Manifesto, and I thought, well, there's actually there's a bigger project from Woomera, and that is other people's projects, and us all getting together and becoming culturally visible and asserting our place in contemporary culture. So that to me it's like, well, let's move on to the next thing, which is having a space in which everyone can make their escape from Woomera if they want, and connect.
One of the things that connected with me around that time is, I mean, I was meeting up nominally as the director of an arts festival, but one of the things that Katharine said was that she was kind of sick of, and I'm paraphrasing you, and just, I know you'll correct me if I've got this wrong, but that, she was kind of a bit sick of everyone kind of looking at Escape from Woomera as an arts project, and she was kind of making the case that, like, it's a game, and I don't want to have to explain the fact that it's a game. Like, games can be all of the things that we are trying to do. They can be socially critical. They can be, they can be provocative. They can be trying to raise political points. There is nothing wrong with it being a game in that context, and that was kind of music to my ears, because I really felt that. I mean, it never quite sat comfortably for me the way the art world, in inverted commas, kind of treated games as objects that they kind of hung on gallery walls in the corner and didn't really it was kind of the wrong context. I was sort of looking at the kind of cultural landscape and going, you've got these places in which you can talk about music, you can talk about film, you can talk about writing, you can talk about any of these things as a cultural form, but you can't have, there's no space to have that conversation about games. And I was looking at the games field at the time, and all the games events were about the industry. They were all based on the premise that it was about shipping units and selling products and investment, and it was all about the money side of it. So you sort of had this really strange, sort of if you looked across the kind of cultural funding portfolios, you had sort of film funding, which would invest in films because they had artistic merit, or they had, they're developing the careers of filmmakers, or they would support experimentation for its own sake. You had art funding that sort of, set up to do that, and then games were just all about industry, just like the whole paradigm that the country was everything that was to do with games was either about industry, or at the other end of the spectrum there was a lot of academic. There were academic forums and conferences that kind of viewed games in a very once removed kind of way, and I just felt we needed to have a space where you could do games in the same way that we treated all the other forms of culture that I was familiar with. Sorry. Yeah.
Katharine?
Sorry, I made a snide interjection. Just as like when Marcus said, that there was a 1 degree removed kind of a anthropological kind of a sense where from the artistic, from the fine arts and academic community, there were there are exceptions to this, but very very much I got the sense, and this might explain for some people why there is a historical tension between and the industry, and in part is because it really felt like the games are the Elgin marbles, right? And what we need to save them is to take them over to the British Museum and put them in a fucking and sort of treat games as these artifacts that created by natives. Who had no. We create trash because we want to create trash. It's not because we sit. We have bosses and we have commercial constraints, and there was very little dialogue between the two communities. There still is kind of a lack of this dialogue, and so one of the aims that Marcus and I and the other people got involved had was to bring these communities together. Plus modders as well, because the modding and mapping scene was big at the time. Bring these people together and get them talking and understanding each other.
I mean, so one of the things that I found interesting looking back at the old programs is that the subtitle for the first 2 or 3 conferences are the Next Wave Independent Game Developers Conference, and so I'm wondering if that was the, because I mean it seems like you're kind of talking about a few different audiences in a way. Like it's like you want to provide a space for game developers and modders and whatever to, think about what they're doing, but also at the same time, push beyond these assumptions in maybe the arts community or the academic community. I mean, so who did you think would come to Free Play?
I mean, from the point of view of Next Wave, I mean, it was kind of an interesting exercise because it was something that I had no. It wasn't awkward for me at all because before I arrived at Next Wave, I'd come from Tina, and Tina was very much in this kind of mindset of just get lots of practitioners together and get them to talk about whatever makes sense in their world. But you have to kind of frame it in. Some of that's just bureaucratic. It's just the way you have to talk about it to kind of fit the boxes to squeeze it into the thing. I still remember the first night of the first Free Play. I went from we should talk about the venue because that's a whole other story. But I went from the venue of the first Free Play to an art exhibition opening. And someone made a remark about getting away from all the young guys, and so someone in the art world was like, really? You got young boys to go to something? And I'm like, well, yeah, there's 300 of them down there, there's, but there's this really weird, there's some of it's gender dynamics, some of it's just target audiences and other things, but it's a really weird, that culture exists in a little box over there that isn't sort of part of mainstream sort of arts and cultural festivals. And I think, if, as much as anything, I think a lot. I'm someone who, if you look at a lot of the things that I've been involved in starting over the years, they have quite boring names to kind of fit the box. The National Young Writers Festival in Newcastle is not what that description would imply, and deliberately so. Like, it's like the description is an excuse to get away with having a kind of event that isn't the kind of event that you could actually put the title on. And I think, to some extent, I'm just someone who's always just kind of gone with, we'll just put whatever name on the label makes sense and won't scare the horses, and we'll just go and do the thing we want to do. And I wouldn't get too overly complicated by that, except that it sort of had to sit within the hierarchy of Next Wave, the event. I think it was always relatively autonomous within the context of Next Wave, but it was, it always had to kind of sit in that frame.
Branding.
Right.
Or not. Yeah.
Well, I mean, like Next Wave was auspicing it, so. And it
would not have happened. I mean, it would never have happened without the resources of Next Wave to carry the.
Oh yeah.
Or any other entity that could have filled that role to carry all the bureaucracy in the back end and the actual building it up. But it was probably always in the back of my mind that culturally, at some point, if I left Next Wave, it probably wouldn't make sense for it to be something that Next Wave would always continue unless there was an alignment and a new director came in who shared that particular passion.
And one director, he did do one, didn't he? I can't remember his name.
Jeff who came in after me, but I think I think it was always, I think in the back of my mind it was always this idea that it may go on to have a life outside of that.
I think some people have said to me that the 2006 one, because that was the Empire Games theme for Next Wave, that sort of took some of the ideas or maybe just themes or vibe of Free Play, because Free Play didn't run in 2006, and sort of maybe moved it back into Next Wave. I don't know. I really don't know. So.
I think I'm trying to remember the whole sequence of events. I know Free Play ran. So Free Play didn't run with the festival in 2006, but it ran. I can't remember what the sequence was, but it ran off when the festival was on, basically.
Yeah.
Does that sound right? Yeah. So I should have gone and looked up my history, but
it was 2004, 5, 7, and then 9. It became its own thing.
Yeah, so it moved into the alternate years of the Next Wave Festival, which was a bit of a conscious decision. I mean, I think, to me, so I set the theme for the 2006 Next Wave Festival. You see, against the backdrop of the Commonwealth Games that was happening in Melbourne at the time, and we took Empire Games as the original name of the Commonwealth Games, reminding everyone of something that had sort of been forgotten, as the theme of the festival that year. And but I think there was a conscious desire for me to bring games or the dynamics of games into the dynamic of the festival, or to play on games as a theme. And so I think there was some cross-pollination between the two, but I think it from a logistical point of view, it started to make sense to put Free Play and the logistics of the festival into different time cycles, basically.
And you mentioned the venue before. Do you want to talk about that?
Katharine, do you remember the venue from the first year? Or the venues, plural, actually?
Yeah, well, Marcus tracked down an old karate club right in downtown Melbourne, and it turned out to be really good, actually. So in that was the main venue, and we had a bar just going in the main session area, which was sort of this non-stop bar. Then we had a room off that room in the karate club for it was this permanent sort of LAN gaming room, so people could play people's mods and maps. There's a lot of Half-Life maps that were locally produced, and some of the mappers who like the Sven Co-op, for example. God, I've just almost broken into French then. So we had some mappers that, for example, gave workshops at Free Play. But there was a LAN gaming room, And then there was 45 downstairs, just up the road. I think it's still around, isn't it? So we had people walking from different venues. So I think there were three venues, 3 or 4, but with one main one. And it really sort of gave an interesting vibe to the event, really. Oh, and we had this big sign saying, because we had like this unofficial slogan, like for like taking the piss out of the Australian Game Developers Conference, which was because they always had some fucking retarded theme, usually that was really corporate sounding. This is the Australian, which is now, yeah, the official industry conference. So our theme, Michelle Reeves made this banner saying, what was it? Something in the innovation in the field of excellence. That was our unofficial theme. Like just some bullshit, meaningless. I mean, if you think of startup bullshit, you think of Silicon Valley bullshit now, like disruption and stuff like that. These bullshit conference themes and just bullshit innovation kind of theme stuff dates way back. And so we had this big banner. I think I've got a photo somewhere of, free play 2000 whatever, innovation in the field of excellence. Like, as in, we don't, that is definitely not what we're doing here. Like, we just don't give a shit about excellence or innovation. It's independent games. So.
And the venue kind of was partially from it was the philosophy for the festival that year, which was just to kind of spread everything in, like, to not use, like, Melbourne has this really very formal cultural infrastructure, and I'd arrived in Melbourne after having done stuff in Newcastle for years, and I just liked all the informal bits, like, the weird things up the end of laneways and the tops of buildings and all sorts of strange places. So as much as possible, we were trying to spread the Next Wave Festival that year just through just things that you had to discover and you had to kind of go through the city to find. But the festival club, which was where we held free play, was just like this bizarre, like recently emptied out karate dojo that we set up as a festival bar that basically ran the duration of the festival. And it was great when free play was on, because everyone said, people had a drink in their hand during a lot of it. I remember getting a bit of feedback from 45 downstairs that they were a little bit surprised about all the people coming in. Like, they're a very
surprised how?
Like,
surprised that there are people coming in.
No, surprise. They're a quality arts venue, Catherine, and they didn't really expect the demographic that we pointed up that way. I think it's fair to say,
What, like pleasantly surprised? Oh.
No, I wouldn't say pleasantly. No.
God, people wonder why I'm paranoid and bitter. Jesus.
But it was sort of like, I had to actually go and have a meeting kind of halfway through and kind of smooth that over, because they're a little bit surprised by all the content and the audience. Well, yeah, there's a lot of young guys wearing a lot of black.
Well, we're the normal people. Developers are the normal people.
It's all relative, whatever angle you're looking at it from,
Yeah. So, I mean, I've had a look at the program. I mean, what kind of stuff were people talking about from memory? What was the vibe like? I mean, was it aligned with that sign you had up, Catherine, that sort of rejection of the usual stuff that you'd find at an event like this? Or, I mean, what were people thinking? What were they wondering about at that point?
I mean, you mentioned earlier that we had certain audiences in mind, and we sort of we kind of had 4 officially in our funding pitch document to Film Victoria.
God, do you remember what was in that? I don't.
Yeah, well, you made me dropped, and or just like this one page of like who are these communities, and right. So and Marcus is like really good at running festivals, so he's like, we've got to get serious about this, and who is the audience? So modders and mappers was one, and bear in mind that game engines were really, there was renderware, it was like $30,000 for a license. There was the Talk game engine, still you needed to pay money for that. Like it's not like it is now. So the way to make your a way to make your own games was to do to these total conversion mods, right? So and you know, Counter-Strike maps and stuff. So the modding and mapping community was big. So that was one community. And another community was the game art community, and the game art community's kind of disappeared as well because they've become indie developers, and you know, art and games have kind of merged a bit. But there was, like, you know, people in fine arts who are doing you know, arty thing, you know, reskinning Doom character models and stuff, and doing crazy things. And so there was them, and so we had like we had one artist who showed all her like like her porn modeling. So, and that caused a bit of a. Do you remember, Marcus, how Big Kid, someone on Big Kid, I think the editor of Big Kid was pretty pissed off about that. Like, said, like, the porn made him really uncomfortable. So we had like this porn session from the art people that kind of made some other people uncomfortable, like sort of worlds colliding kind of thing. And then we had the third group was game developers in industry, and I was one of those people. And I, you know, and me and Jim got other people from industry to give talks. So there was like people within AAA game development with jobs who were really suffering from working conditions. Because if you remember, this is kind of slightly before the EA spouse scandal hit, and there are a lot of sort of quietly angry and creatively frustrated game developers in Melbourne, and it was a bigger industry in terms of AAA development than it is now at the time. And then the fourth group were indie developers who were making indie games from scratch, and there were little pockets around Australia who were kind of working in isolation. No one really they didn't really have a high visibility, often servicing little hobby, you know, like really specific, like tactical strategy games, for example, or you know, subscription-based, you know, community, you know, tight little fan communities, and like Nocturnal Games was one developer I remember at the time. But yeah, there are a few of them. So those are the four indie game developers themselves. There certainly weren't as many as there are now. Modders and mappers, who are quasi indie developers really, game developers in AAA industry, and game artists who, like, and all these communities have kind of merged now in a sense, because all those four groups are kind of now versions of indie games in a way. I mean, maybe you could think about it in that way. It's kind of interesting how that's kind of
it was
this
also
convergence.
I mean, looking back now, it's also an era where the industry seemed to be going in a very different direction than probably where it's ended up. Like, it seemed to be going in the direction of higher and higher and higher budgets, more and more controlled, like less and less opportunity. I mean, Katharine can probably reflect on this better than I can, but less and less opportunities for small-scale developers or indie developers or others to kind of get a foot in the door. You know, it was it was an era where you know, just to get access to the console platforms that seemed to be dominating, you needed to have big budgets behind you just to get the gear, you know, and a whole other world has opened up since then. That was kind of, you could sort of see in the early years of free play, it was kind of bursting at the seams to get out, but there were the industrial / capital / whatever limitations of the industry meant that it was really hard for those people to get their games to an audience, you know.
I mean, that's I was going to say that you both almost really answered my next question, which is that I mean, how could you be independent at this point in time? I mean, there's this Katharine, I don't know if you've read this essay by Eric Zimmerman that was written about 2 years before free play began, where
and published in the Game On.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I mean, so if he's asking questions about do independent developers really exist then, I mean, maybe he was just wrong, I don't know. But it seems like an interesting point.
Can we add in
sorry?
Just an extra detail at this point. Katharine, can we acknowledge that you were actually anonymous at the time, and it's kind of interesting to talk about why?
Yeah, I was anonymous, and I guess I had to use pseudonyms and stuff, and not even have a pseudonym written on any printed material. Well, I say I had to. I felt like I had to, and that was because I had a very real, because I was breaching contract, in fact, and a lot of game developers still have these contracts. It's very standard industry still. To have to do any game-related activities or any creative-related activities outside of your working hours is still actually owned by the company. So. So Escape from Wimmera, I used Kipper as a pseudonym, but I was so paranoid at this point in time of free play that I couldn't even put a pseudonym to anything, because, for example, my bosses were very twitchy about free play. They were very twitchy about the knowledge that there were some people that we'd asked to speak, like, I think we had Rod Green speaking about mip mapping or something, which was like, whoa, at the time. And
what do you mean?
Sorry?
So what do you mean twitchy? Like,
not happy, like that their employees were going after. I mean, this was an unsanctioned. This is not the Australian Game Developers Conference sponsored by every corporate whore in town. Like, this was like people are going to go and talk without the boss's supervision. Basically, I mean, we wanted this to be give platforms to the little guy and girl. The people who aren't very articulate maybe, and they're not very confident, and maybe they're a bit young, and they're nobody's boss, and they can get up and they can talk about the cool maps they make and stuff, or working conditions. We had a session on working conditions, and that was very important because it was a session with no bosses there, right? So that, yeah, so they expressed their displeasure. Also, I had written an article, an opinion piece in The Age, a couple of years prior, about America's Army, the game America's Army, and war in Afghanistan and stuff. And I put my name on it, right? But I didn't put, I said I was a Melbourne-based game developer, but I didn't say who I worked for. But, sure enough, one of my bosses invited me into his office and said, well, what if Bruno Bonnell is at a cocktail party in New York with George Bush? That would suck. So don't do that again. So I was very much aware that, and I wasn't like model employee of the month. Like, I was sort of on the quiet recruiting people to the union. So, I wasn't favorite, I wasn't employee of the month. So if they
I'm going to go as far as to say that you're a bit of a shit stirrer.
No, I would say, like, I wasn't, I didn't want to give people an excuse to get rid of me, but I regret this because fuck it, I should have just left my job actually, but money is an issue, and I was too scared,
As someone who came in from outside, I dealt with people who worked for publishing companies and worked for record labels and worked like all of these other creative, sort of commercial creative fields, filmmakers, people that I know that have worked in all of these fields. And it freaked me out to realise that the level of, I guess, kind of corporate control in the game industry at the time, it was completely different to any other creative field. Like, if you work for a record company or you work for a film, you're expected to have a side project. Like, that's the whole point. You go and take...
Really?
No, you go and have a corporate day job to work on a side project. There are some rare, there's some exceptions to that rule, I guess. If you're in creative development at a TV network, whatever you come up with is meant to serve the TV network. But basically, everyone who works at that time, everyone who worked in all of the other commercial creative fields I knew, the expectation was that they were a somewhat casualised labour force who were always going to switch on to other projects and be developing their own projects in parallel. That's how television works. That's how film works. That's how to a certain extent the music industry works. All of those publishing, all of those fields tend to work with an understanding that that's what it is to be a creative professional in those fields, and then coming into games and realizing that they had this kind of incredibly tight control over a very, I guess, a very what probably started out as a very young and enthusiastic workforce who were so enamored with being in the industry. And so I guess, you know, it was, I mean, free play to me was an exercise in trying to carve out a space where the creativity of that community could be realized, or at least, you know, exposed, you know.
Yeah, I want people who weren't around then to realize how freedom was really important. Like, independence, like, was really important, you know, because and people will disagree. You know, like, this isn't the experience of everyone back then, obviously, but there were you know, not everyone was working stupid long hours. Not everyone, you know, and bosses, you know, like they, you know, they're your friend and they're good guys and stuff. It's this stuff is behind the scenes, and this stuff is not always explicit. And you know, people, you could say I was totally paranoid. Maybe I was, but you know, like, can I read like a paragraph from the Scratchware Manifesto, because like about freedom, because it's people, like, this is written in 2000, and some people will know what the Scratchware Manifesto is, but it's a manifesto to, yeah, it's like I describe it as a battle cry, you know, and this is written by people in industry anonymously, so I'm not the only paranoid one. These people couldn't name, for years they couldn't put their names to this, and some people know that, you know, later people including Greg Kostikian owned up. So the beginning of this, I mean, it's quite grandiose sounding, but people were passionate about this. The machinery of gaming has run amok. Instead of serving creative vision, it suppresses it. Instead of encouraging innovation, it represses it. Instead of taking its cue from our most imaginative minds, like that, you know, game developers and others, it takes its cue from the latest month's PC data list, you know, marketing. Instead of rewarding those who succeed, it penalizes them with development budgets so high and royalties so low that there can be no reward for creators. Instead of ascribing credit to those who deserve it, it seeks to associate success with the corporate machine. It is time for revolution. And it goes on and it talks about, you know, many things, working conditions, publish. You know, the big enemy was publishers at the time, right? And publishers are still arseholes, but they're arseholes in different ways now, I think, slightly different. Yeah, but at the time there was this quite well, you know, a growing discontent about the state of the lack of freedom and creative freedom and independence, and for people stuck in this corporate machine.
It's probably swung around a bit since then, but I mean, me looking at it as a kind of outsider at that point, or not, or you know, as a player and a user who, this is my culture, but it's not the one I make, you know, is that games. Like, I had this kind of weird sort of dawning moment. So I was like, it's the first kind of post-corporate cultural form. Like, you know, it's a cultural form that's developed in the era of corporate culture, as opposed to, maybe it's the first, maybe it's not. But, you know, if you go back and look at film, you know, you had this long history of film before the industry kind of came in and kind of commoditized it. And I remember having a Commodore 64 in the early, you know, 80s, to date myself, and, you know, I remember typing in, programs from the back of, you know, magazines that used to be distributed on, and buying tapes from for a brief period of time.
Yeah,
you know, quite small publishers, and then all of that sort of suddenly gets sucked up into this whole machine that at that time was controlling the whole. I mean, it's the distribution channel. The whole distribution and marketing channel was being controlled in a very narrow way. Now, I think that's exploded in a really interesting way since then. But so it's kind of, in some ways, it's kind of hard to like capture that cultural moment, because right now you know, the distribution is much more open again. But like looking at it just then, you know, you had this era where, you know, everything was on the whims of the distributors who controlled the shelf space, who controlled the, you know, the whole dynamics. There were independent games, but there wasn't a viable market or audience dynamic for them. There wasn't a distribution platform, so you basically had you had these weird art projects going off at one end. You had people kind of doing things sort of almost symbolically at that end, and then you had this sort of mega industry that kind of sat in the middle. And obviously there were people around the edges of that who were pushing back against it. I think what's happened since shows that there were a lot of them, and they were pushing back in lots of different ways. But it felt like the industrial dynamic of the industry was completely overriding the cultural and creative form, and that was to the detriment of games, you know.
Mm.
There was oh, sorry.
Go.
Oh, I just wanted to add, in terms of an interesting change related to that, was that indie games were seen as really nerdy and awkward, really uncool. And one of the challenges, I remember if anyone's read Death to the Game Industry, that was published in Game Developer magazine. It was written by Greg Kostecki, and he gave a speech at GDC called Death to the Game Industry. And he said what we need to do is make independent games cool, make them hip, and lots of people were like, oh, that's never going to happen. That's impossible. Like, independent games are ugly. That the graphic, they don't have great graphics. Like, they're just, nerds make them like super nerds. And everyone wants to play shiny console games. No one wants to play these shitty, tiny little games. No one's gonna. So people were like, "That's not going to happen. They're not going to be cool." And look what happened. It's like it's sort of cooler than cool.
It did feel like you're at a time where the whole industry was dominated by the search for ever more realistic, photorealistic explosions and engine sounds. Or sports simulator. It's like the entire creativity of this giant industry was kind of focused down towards these very narrow paths of innovating. Like, there's no innovation in the form, no innovation in the, it's not that there wasn't, but like the whole industry was like, explosions, 20% better than last time, and graphics, we've got better engines as the ball kind of bounces away, but the form itself wasn't really moving anywhere near as much as the potential of its audience and the potential of people that made it wanted it to.
So there are exceptions, but yeah, of course. I mean, we can't. Yeah, I mean, like, I'm sure people will say, "Oh, what about this and what about that?" Well, but in general, that was definitely the feeling expressed by people.
Well, there were individuals doing that, but the community for it wasn't well developed or well articulated, and didn't have, like, the potential of it was not being realised. Is probably the
and having we have, like, just to put things in perspective for people, we have in Australia. I mean, I'm not in Australia, but there's something called public broadcasting, right? Public broadcasting is a model that supports television and radio, and there's historical support of Australian film as well. That based on the notion that that these cultural forms are important beyond profit. And you hear people talking about the number of Victorian jobs created by the game industry, and how many billions of dollars a year. Like, often journalists, and they don't, not so much anymore, but they'll start with the game industry is worth more than Hollywood. People don't start a film criticism article with the film industry is worth more than selling pens. Yeah. So and people should, when they think about culture, they think about actually how much state support goes into culture that makes absolutely no money, but it is seen as a public good, and then ask themselves why game developers often have to find themselves making trash culture. There's different cultural rules for games.
And this has been my obsession all the way through, just in general. I think you've always had this weird, in terms of cultural forms, you've always had this weird problem between, look, if it's been around for 200 years, it's culturally legitimate. You can afford to throw huge amounts of money at losing money on supporting this because it's worthy, in inverted commas. then you have anything that's, doesn't have that kind of weight of historical validation. It's got to make money. It's got to be a market. There's no space for this idea that the value of cultural worth or cultural experimentation or exploring ideas or exploring a form exists outside the kind of classical framework that we've historically funded that in. And I think games are a really good example of that. I mean, it's not all that long ago we were debating whether photography was a legitimate art medium, or film was actually, a creative form or whatever. So you get these inevitable kind of lags, and I think part of that is inevitably generational, but I also think part of that is to go back to that kind of that period in the game industry. Part of that is generational, but part of that is also to do with the peculiar dynamics of the industry and the medium. Like, you actually had a period there where the medium was so concentrated in terms of who had access to it and what people were seeing that it got difficult to legitimise some of those arguments because the potential wasn't even being scratched, in terms of what the public was seeing.
Mm. And so, do you think that people are still asking similar questions in games, or have they just moved on to completely new ones? I mean, are they just variants of these same questions that people ask today?
What questions in particular?
Sorry. Well, I guess like the kind of questions that you were asking in the first pre-play, around the worth of culture, the worth of games, the place of games, what you can do with games.
I'm in a way I'm kind of sick of the whole. I'm not in a way. I'm thoroughly sick of the whole games art discussion.
Can I just add to that? I'm sick of the whole is anything art discussion. It's just so stupidly boring.
Mm.
Well, because I think there is a real danger, and we talked about money and value and culture and stuff. I think there is a bit of an elephant in the room. Okay, it's fairly visible, and other people have talked about this, but there is a danger in institutionalization. I mean, in some respect, what I want to say is if we crown, if we crown games with this kind of art crown, right, and we turn it, we high culture it up, at the same time as when public and private universities have gotten into the action in a really serious way, where these large institutions are making quite a bit of money, pumping out, thousands of graduates all around the world for very expensive degrees, and now these institutions which weren't really kind of involved in games before are now solidly almost at the set. I have to say I've been doing a PhD to get me some scholarship money to live on. Like, that's how fucked up. Like, how many people do you see at these events who actually have PhDs, or who actually are university lecturers, or who are students? Like, and that's how they earn their money in order to make games, right? And this, we're sort of clinging to these institutions in a sense, because we need to eat. But the flip side of that is it's like having a sugar daddy, right? Like, he funds your lifestyle, you get a place to live, but at the end of the day, he might fuck you. Like, that's, I mean, I think we have to look critically at what it means for what the involvement of institutions and universities behind the scenes or in front of the scenes mean. Are we a truly independent industry if we have to sort of cling to if we have to, like I'm clinging right now, like I'm not the only one, do we have the, in an industry where most iPhone, most tablet and mobile games totally fail. Do we have a sustainable business model yet where discoverability and most people I know in indie games are really, really struggling, like to make ends meet, and we still have, in some ways more than ever, a really hit-driven industry, and indie games is really, really hit-driven, and everyone knows it, right? And so, I think there are problems in terms of questions. There are problems that need to be addressed. We don't have this utopia that, we don't have this we don't have an ideal kind of world yet, not at all. I'm sort of uncomfortable with, maybe because I'm sort of like, maybe I'm anti-intellectual or something, which is ironic, seeing as I'm doing a PhD. However, I'm uncomfortable with the fact that I'm doing a PhD, and half the people I know are doing PhDs or have finished PhDs or ending up teaching at universities and stuff. I'm not comfortable with universities, for example, and institutions, large institutions, being in charge of our shit, or wanting to be in charge, getting their hands on their fucking grubby little paws, and it's great that they're, supporting, that they're involved, right? And what am I going to do? Give the money back for my scholarship? But I feel that's not. I think we need to sort of think about what if those universities went away? What if there were no game students? Because a lot of these indie games are actually produced within the confines of academia, because because you got to live with your parents or something. It's still not when people were writing the Scratchway Manifesto, they were talking about having a big bitch, right, about stuff, but they were also saying, well, how can we make this work? How can we have a business model that can actually, we don't have to rely on publishers, we can rely on ourselves. And I don't think we're fully able to rely on ourselves right now, the vast majority of independent game developers, anyway. Sorry, that was a long rant.
No. Really interesting. I think we're almost out of time. Looking at the hashtag, there's not too many questions there at the moment, so I think maybe we can end with just one final question, which I guess is the obvious one. Looking back, would you go back and change anything? Are you happy with how it turned out?
I think, but I just had this messed around. I think Marcus should have the last few minutes.
Oh no! Look, I mean, no, you go first. I'm interested in what you have to say.
I can't think of anything. I think you should. You've got the big view. You're the big picture guy because the stuff that you've done. Yeah, I mean the stuff you've done in other parts of Australian culture, like you would have the, it's. I think you'd have the most interesting thing to say about that. So. I mean, you've seen the changes in other parts of the cultural landscape.
Look, I think it's interesting to me is I think in terms of the whole academic thing, I don't get. I mean, you both at universities. I got kicked out of uni second year twice, and I never got a degree. So I don't have a clue on that the front of how universities relate to the whole world. But I think what's interesting to me is that the problems you described there start to bring games much more into alignment with the whole. The more general problems of the cultural dynamics of the world that like other forms, like people that are doing music that pushes boundaries often end up in universities. People that are doing visual arts, so it's you see the same. That phenomenon is a more common one, and I guess that implies, when I say kind of mainstreaming of the problems of the games industry, I don't necessarily mean like commercialized mainstreaming. I kind of like, it sort of brought it more into alignment with the broader dynamics of making culture in the world that we live in more generally. And I don't know whether that's an improvement or a loss, frankly. I mean, I'm not really close enough to tell. In terms of what interests me, I mean, if you look at my interests across all sort of cultural and creative forms, I'm really interested in the capacity for people who are creative to try things, test ideas, push boundaries, experiment in sort of 360 degrees, to not just be able to try and experiment by better marketing or trying to appeal to this same narrow group of people over there that everyone else is trying to appeal to. And I look at the landscape of games, and as someone who's sort of, I guess I've got one foot in the water, it appears to have improved on that front substantially in the last decade or so. Like I'm seeing more opportunities for more people to be able to do things that are outside the boxes that are defined and prescribed for them, or at the very least there are a lot more boxes. So like the boxes, the shape of there are small boxes now where there used to only be big boxes, So in that sense, I feel like things have kind of moved forward in an interesting kind of way. I still feel like we haven't really won that cultural argument about games. I don't think games have yet been brought into alignment. Like they don't still have the same. To look at sort of other cultural forms, you can't. I don't know. Maybe Dan will know this more than I will, but you can't just go and make the argument that you want to make a game that is culturally interesting and just have someone support that because of its intrinsic value. We're still not quite there yet. There may be other means, like philanthropy doesn't seem to exist at least in Australia, it doesn't seem to exist in games in the same way that it does in other creative forms. And so there's a whole bunch of, I think there are still areas to be improved. I think you've got to create more channels. But I don't know, like I feel like I got involved in something at a particular era, and the trajectory that it was on then, the things that I was worried about, there are new things to worry about, but a lot of them have improved for the better. That's, I guess, where I kind of look at it.
Mm. All right. Anything you want to add before we end?
Well, thanks very much, Dan, for like it's like the fact that the fact that free play has continued on,
it's fucking awesome. It's still going.
Because people have put in hard work. People like you, Dan. So yeah. Well, thanks.
Yeah.
Otherwise, who is this? Who are these Marcus and Katharine people? Like, what was this thing called for? Oh, and I want to say, just again, we had a committee of people. It was a national committee of people as well, and like Jim, people like Rebecca. There was people in Adelaide, people in Brisbane, and so there were a lot of people who we sort of put the idea together, but then we set to work getting people involved from the community and those I remember Paul Milishko being a volunteer, and then later there are people who put in a lot of hard work and from Next Wave as well, so so we just happen to
that's
now.
Still very true today. I mean, the only way we can deliver a 10-day festival is because we have before on the day volunteers, we have 27 people working on the festival, so that's how it happens, and that's how it's continued to happen, I think. Cool. All right.
Looking back, one of the things. Sorry, just to jump in on a last moment. Just one of the things I think is most successful now, looking back, is that there is a community for this. To me, I think that's the most. I mean, looking back at things I've been involved in, I think that's the most successful thing. Whereas I don't feel like at the time we sort of started this, there was fractured bits of communities that hadn't quite linked up. And looking back and seeing that there is a community that is invested in and owns and is growing with the thing like that, to me, that's the best reward of all.
Yeah, there was to have an identity that is independent game, indie games as a thing. It was, I couldn't even spell it. In one thing I wrote INDY. I mean, that was how below the radar this stuff was.
Yeah, I've seen that a few times. Whether people mean Indiana Jones games, I don't know.
You don't have to rub it.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you both so much for your time. It's been really, really great.
Thank you.
Get you involved in our 10th festival.
Have a great festival.
Thank you. I hope we will. It already has been great. So, and to anybody watching as well, thanks for joining us for the final panel of the online festival. I hope you've enjoyed it and come join us for.
Oh my
some...
God! You mean people are watching? Sorry.
They're all archived. They're all right there, ready.
Yeah.
So, all right, cool. I think that might as well do us. So, thanks very much. We'll.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Mark.
Bye.